Today we're going to talk about volunteer tourism and all the different stakeholders that comprise what I would like to call the volunteer tourism ecosystem. First things, in the center of everything are the projects and of course the volunteer tourists, who are the main players. Without the volunteer tourists, we wouldn't be here discussing volunteer tourism as it's a very interesting phenomenon. And of course, without the projects, the volunteers wouldn't be interested to go and help, whether that is improving the lives of locals, helping the environment. In our case, we're going to look at volunteers that go and help in children refuges or orphanages. So the main players in this game, of course, are the projects and the volunteer tourists. And of course, close to them we've got the local NGOs. The local NGOs are the ones that identify or work with the projects, and then they work with the sending organizations to source volunteers that in turn help the projects. Now, when we look at volunteer tourism in general, we cannot overlook the role that tourism businesses play in these relationships, because we always have the tourism element in volunteer tourism that we must not ignore. And of course, hand in hand with the tourism businesses, and in this ecosystem goes the local workforce, who obviously benefit from the presence of volunteers, increased commerce, and all the tourism aspects of volunteer tourism. And of course, a very important player in this rectangle of relationships is also the government, which we must not ignore. Now, in order to show all the interesting relationships between the different stakeholders, I will be using arrows, and of course different colors of arrows in order to distinguish different relationships. So let's start with the projects and see what relationships and impacts they have from the other stakeholders in play. So as we can see, arrow A illustrates that the projects depend on the sending organizations in order for them to give them volunteers and also put them on their portfolio, on their websites, the brochures. And of course, the sending organizations depend on the projects in order for them to be able to place volunteers. Now, also the projects work with the local NGOs, and the local NGOs offer direct support, administration to the project, and they have a very close relationship in order to offer volunteers all they need while in situ. But of course, in these relationships, we must never forget that the volunteer tourists themselves, in many cases, just show up at the projects and they offer their help. And this is becoming more and more prominent as the internet is offering people access to these projects, which of course creates some problems, especially in terms of screening the volunteers and protecting some vulnerable groups, as people have identified in the research. The volunteers themselves definitely work closely with the local NGOs, and they need them because the local NGOs are the ones that in many cases act on behalf of the sending organizations in order to provide the accommodation, food, local support, the local know-how, and without them, the volunteer tourists will be lost in many cases. And of course, the volunteer tourists pay for all this accommodation and all these other services as part of the placement fee that they pay to the sending organization before they come out. And of course, the sending organization provides the training and the support that the volunteers need before they go out. And the third, of course, relationship is the one between volunteer tourists and local tourism businesses, because for the tourism element of volunteer tourism, we need the tourism businesses in order for the volunteers to go out, have a good time, but also have the infrastructure and things in place to make their stay as enjoyable as possible. Then we've got the government, which of course provides volunteer tourists with everything they need in order to enter the country and survive in the country, like local infrastructure, but things like visas and permissions to come in and any other paperwork the volunteers might require. The other relationship, of course, is government and projects, and in many cases, as these organizations are part of the third sector in many ways, they step in to fill a gap that the private and the government, of course the public sector, cannot fill. And this is where the government may or may not should be doing more to help these projects. But as we're going to see later, there are some barriers to this. C, we've got the government and the tourism businesses, because as business is good for the local entrepreneurs and local businesses, they pay taxes, but of course that should be a problem if these businesses are illegal or they are black market, as we're going to see later. But in general, the government should be looking favorably to this increased commerce and the benefits they can get from the presence of volunteers and how they spend their money with these tourism businesses. D, we've got the government and the local NGOs. Why? Because obviously they need licenses, support, infrastructure in order to operate, and in some countries, more than others, they might actually need some kind of protection, especially in the case of some corruption or things like that. And finally, we've got government and the sending organizations, where the sending organizations, they need the support and the help of the government in order to operate in the country. In other cases, the sending organizations don't deal directly with the government, but they use the local NGOs as proxies in order to operate within a country. The next stakeholder we're going to look at is the local NGOs, and of course how they operate with the tourism businesses. And of course this happens as the local NGOs are the ones that control, let's say, the movement of the volunteers, and tourism businesses want to be in their good books in order to have access to these new paying customers. Now, the sending organizations also, as we said earlier, work with the local NGOs, but they also work with the local businesses, especially in the case of these sending organizations that put extra emphasis on the entertainment and tourism element of volunteer tourism. So they do need the local tourism businesses to supplement the experience of the volunteers. The tourism businesses themselves, they seem to be following the projects, as there's a lot of evidence of commerce, shops, taxi stands, tuk-tuk stands, laundromats, five-a-side football pitches, mushrooming around where the volunteers are based and where they live. So we must not ignore that. The local workforce is another factor that we need to discuss, because they work with the local NGOs and they offer jobs and opportunity, and we also have the local workforce being employed in local tourism businesses, and the increased customer numbers through volunteer tourism helps that. But we also have local workforce working for the projects. Either they help in the projects, like the mamas in the refugees or the orphanages, or they train volunteers. So we must not overlook their role. But we also have the fact that in many cases, while the local workforce benefits from the volunteers, we must not overlook the fact that they might also get displaced by the volunteers, and that sometimes creates resentment towards them. So when we look at this very interesting set of relationships, we must not forget that it doesn't always work as straightforward, because there are barriers that come into play, and they minimize the effect and the benefit that this ecosystem could have for everyone. So if we look at barrier 1, we clearly have an interesting relation between the local NGOs and the projects, and in some cases the support the NGOs are offering to the projects gets barred and cannot have the full effect because of the agency of the locals. Like in many cases, some kind of donation, some kind of equipment that the local workforce doesn't look favorable towards, like a washing machine, as we found in the findings, or the way donations are being distributed, that can actually have an effect on the impact volunteer tourism can actually have. Barrier 2 looks at the relation between the projects and the sending organizations, because that of course will depend on the policy that the sending organizations have in place in terms of benefiting the project. So, to put in more simple terms, what percentage of the placement fee the volunteer tourists pay actually reaches the projects or goes to overheads and profit maximization for the sending organization. But that is not for discussion now. Barrier 3 looks at the relation between government and the projects, and in many cases in countries like Cambodia or other countries where corruption is rife, the projects are neglected or they have to be patronized by certain government officials in order for them to be able to operate. Barrier 4 looks at the relation between government and businesses, and this barrier stops the, let's say, tax going one way to the other, because maybe the tourism businesses are in the black market or the government wants a kind of a share or a kickback in order to allow the tourism businesses to flourish. And barrier 5, of course, looks at the effect that the volunteer tourists have on the projects, and that of course will depend on their training, their commitment, and of course the task at hand. Simple tasks mean the volunteer can do them with very little training. Complicated tasks and complex procedures and things like that mean that the language barrier and other shortcomings the volunteer may have will act as a barrier towards what they can achieve and how they can contribute. Having looked now at this ecosystem, we must not forget that while this is, let's say, the above board volunteer tourism ecosystem, this ecosystem and phenomenon is being simulated by people that see the opportunity of volunteer tourism in order to create profits from themselves and maybe employment for others. So we do have this simulation that takes place, and we found it in and through our fieldwork. So we had people simulating an orphanage in order to attract donations. We had people simulating a food bank. We had people simulating tours in orphanages. And so the idea was that they will come in, take some pictures, pick up some children, and then they will just leave just as fast as they arrived. Which of course begs the question, why is this popular? And of course it is popular because not everybody has the time to offer a couple of weeks or a month to these children, but they feel a lot better if they're solicited for a donation, they make one, and they feel they have made the part. Which of course points to the discrepancies in pro-poor tourism, where you have on the one hand you've got volunteer tourism that immerses the tourist into the experience, and on the other hand you also have things like slum tourism that is very, very fast and less intimate, but they both serve the same goal, if you would like, which is alleviate the guilt of the visitor, but also contribute to some extent to a project. Taking a closer look to this simulation, we can see that we have a similar situation again, the same rectangle, if you would like, but this time some of the players have been changed. So where we had projects, now we have staged projects. Why? Because somebody is creating a simulation of a refuge or a project in order to attract donations and solicit the empathy and sympathy of the tourists, which of course are not volunteers in this case, but they're just tourists, people that for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, they want to go in somewhere, offer the support, and then just leave. So you see then, we've got the tourists, the stage projects, and the tourism businesses in an interesting relationship here that we can see from this triangle that actually is mutually beneficial to everyone. The tourists get to feel better about themselves and make a donation and experience something they haven't seen before. The tourism businesses benefit because locally the tourists go there, spend their money, or they might be using certain services to get to the project. And of course the operators of the stage project benefit, and even the children that they have in the project, they might also, their families benefit because they're being rented, as we found in this study. So clearly then we can see that this is taking place, it is a simulation of what is going on in volunteer tourism. The question is, how is this allowed to happen, especially when it comes to the government? And as you can see from this triangle, in order for this to exist, the government either needs to look the other way or support it, and that of course create an interesting relationship between these three players, which you could say is about opportunity and maybe a little bit of corruption, because in certain countries these places are able to operate because the government is not doing anything about it, or some government officials are getting some kind of we don't want to use the term kickback, but they are looking the other way, most certainly. Now, looking at the NGOs and the sending organizations, who are of course some of the main stakeholders of volunteer tourism, why don't they do something? Yes, there is evidence that they keep telling the volunteers not to be scammed by these schemes and these places, but at the moment they don't do really much. There's something like a triangle of inaction of these stakeholders, as they either ignore or overlook. But the issue here is that it's still small scale, and they don't think it's actually having such a big effect, which of course makes us think that if this was to become a bigger phenomenon, then they will turn their head and try and do something about it. But at the moment, it's evident that future research needs to focus on this simulated orphanages, simulated projects that actually attract donations and scam tourists. If we don't do something about this now, then what will happen is the simulacrum will become far more successful, as it is a far better proposition for the tourists than volunteer tourism is, with all its sacrifice, time involvement, and cost. So future research is needed.